Дата 1945 года. Рейнская равнина, Германия. A formation of P-51D Mustangs, 8 aircraft, cruising at 27,000 feet above a landscape that no longer resembled anything a cartographer would recognize. Towns below were craters ringed by rubble. Roads were broken spines. The Rhine itself, gray and indifferent, cut through the wreckage like it had no idea what century it was. One of those Mustangs carried a pilot who had, by that point, developed a habit his squadron commander had explicitly told him to stop. He was running his Merlin engine outside the approved power envelope. Not recklessly, not carelessly. He had a method, a precise, calculated sequence of throttle inputs and manifold pressure settings that pushed his aircraft into a performance band that the Allison derivative handbook said did not exist. His crew chief had noticed the wear patterns on the engine after missions. His armorer had noticed nothing, because the guns were barely the point. The point was speed. The point was that when the first silver shape appeared at 9 o'clock low, thin, engineless looking, impossibly fast, this pilot did not do what every other Mustang pilot did. He did not dive away. He turned into it. What happened in the next 4 minutes would produce one of the most studied and least officially acknowledged aerial engagements of the European Air War. It would force a re-examination of assumptions that both the 8th Air Force and the Luftwaffe's own jet evaluation units had spent the better part of 18 months treating as settled fact. And it would raise a question that aeronautical engineers on both sides of the Atlantic were still arguing about when the war ended. How do you make a propeller-driven fighter outrun a jet? To understand the answer, and to understand why the answer was simultaneously obvious and completely forbidden, we need to go back. Not to the war, further back than that, to the engine sitting inside the Mustang's airframe, and to the specific, almost biological relationship between that engine and the man who learned to push it past every limit the manual described. The engine they didn't design for war. The Rolls-Royce Merlin did not begin as a weapon. It began as an embarrassment. In the early 1930s, Britain's aviation establishment was consumed by one specific obsession: the Schneider Trophy. This was an international seaplane race that had, by 1931, become less a sporting event and more a national prestige contest, conducted at speeds that killed pilots with regularity. The Supermarine S.6B, the aircraft that won the trophy outright for Britain in 1931, was powered by a Rolls-Royce R engine, producing 2,350 horsepower. It flew at 407 miles per hour. In 1931, the embarrassment came afterward. Britain had the fastest aircraft in the world, powered by the most powerful aero engine in the world, and almost none of it was transferable to anything the Royal Air Force actually needed. The R engine was a sprint engine. It could sustain full power for perhaps 30 minutes before destroying itself. It required a fuel mixture so exotic it was essentially racing blend. It needed a ground crew of specialists and a maintenance window measured in days between flights. Reginald Mitchell, who designed the Supermarine aircraft, and Ernest Hives, who ran Rolls-Royce's development program, looked at the R engine and saw something different from what everyone else saw. Everyone else saw a dead end. They saw a starting point. The Merlin that emerged from that process between 1933 and 1935 was a fundamentally different animal. 12 cylinders, 60-degree V configuration, liquid-cooled, with a displacement of 27 liters. In its initial production form, the Merlin 1, it produced 1,030 horsepower. That number tells you almost nothing useful. What matters is what the engine was designed to sustain, and for how long, and under what conditions. Here is the key detail. The Merlin was designed around a concept that sounds obvious but was, at the time, genuinely controversial. Supercharging. A supercharger is, in its simplest form, a pump. It takes the thin air at altitude, where there is not enough oxygen to allow an engine to develop its sea-level power, and compresses it before forcing it into the cylinders. A supercharged engine can maintain its power output at altitudes where an unsupercharged engine would be gasping at a fraction of its rated output. The Merlin used a gear-driven centrifugal supercharger, meaning it was mechanically connected to the crankshaft. Spin the engine faster. Spin the supercharger faster. Force more air into the cylinders. By 1939, the Merlin III in the Hurricane and the early Spitfire was producing 1,030 horsepower at rated conditions. By 1940, the Merlin XII in the Spitfire II was producing 1,175 horsepower. By 1942, the Merlin 61, the two-stage, two-speed supercharged version that transformed the Spitfire V from an aircraft losing the performance race into one winning it, was producing 1,565 horsepower at altitude. Stop and hold that trajectory. From 1935 to 1942, 7 years, the Merlin went from 1,030 horsepower to 1,565 horsepower, a 52% increase in output from the same basic engine architecture. No new displacement, no new cylinder count. Supercharging, fuel quality improvements, and the willingness of Rolls-Royce's engineers to keep pushing the operating limits upward. The Merlin 66, fitted to the Spitfire 9 and later the Mustang 3 in RAF service, produced 1,720 horsepower. The Packard-built V1650-7, the specific Merlin variant fitted to the P51D Mustang that concerns us here, produced 1,490 horsepower at military power, the setting you used in combat, and 1,695 horsepower at war emergency power, a setting that could be sustained for exactly 5 minutes before the engine began accumulating damage that would shorten its service life measurably. That 5-minute limit is where this story actually begins, because there was another number. A number that did not appear in the pilot's handbook, that was not taught in any official training syllabus, and that a specific group of pilots had discovered, tested, and passed among themselves in the way that dangerous knowledge always travels. Quietly, pilot to pilot, usually over a drink, always with the caveat that you did not tell the squadron commander. The Merlin could be pushed past war emergency power. Not safely. Not officially, but it could be done, and the aircraft would not immediately fall out of the sky, and the speed increase was not trivial. Meet First Lieutenant Raymond Earl Wetmore, 21 years old, from St. Joseph, Missouri. Before the war, he had been a student at Missouri Valley College, where he had studied, of all things, mechanical engineering for 2 semesters before the draft notice arrived. He flew P-51D Mustangs with the 359th Fighter Group, 8th Air Force, based at East Wreatham in Norfolk, England. He had 21 confirmed aerial victories by early 1945, making him one of the top aces in the 8th Air Force, and he had a reputation among his fellow pilots for an approach to his aircraft that his crew chief, a technical sergeant named Harold Buxton from Lansing, Michigan, described in a post-war interview as, like a man who is always looking for a gear the engineers forgot to put in. Wetmore was not the only pilot pushing Merlin power limits past the manual. He was not even the first, but he was, by the accounts of pilots who flew with him, the most methodical about it. He had noticed something. When he pushed past war emergency power, past the limits the handbook described, the engine did not immediately protest. There was a window. A specific band of manifold pressure and RPM that produced performance the handbook said was impossible, and the engine, for reasons that would take engineers another decade to fully explain, tolerated it for longer than the 5-minute war emergency limit suggested it should. The explanation, which Wetmore had arrived at intuitively rather than analytically, had to do with the relationship between fuel mixture, detonation, and the specific octane rating of the fuel being used in the European theater of operations in late 1944 and early 1945. Here is the technical reality. A piston engine produces power by burning a fuel-air mixture inside a cylinder. The mixture ignites, expands, pushes the piston down, turns the crankshaft. The problem that limits power output is detonation, when the mixture ignites spontaneously, out of sequence, before the spark plug fires. Detonation is violent. It hammers the pistons, destroys rings, cracks heads. It is the enemy of high power output. The defense against detonation is octane rating. Higher octane fuel resists detonation at higher compression ratios and higher manifold pressures. The Merlin was rated for 100 octane fuel. By late 1944, the fuel being supplied to 8th Air Force fighter groups in England was not 100 octane. It was 150 octane, the product of American refineries that had been pushing fuel technology as hard as Rolls-Royce had been pushing engine technology. And this is the key detail that the official power charts had not caught up with. The charts were written for 100 octane fuel. The engines were running on 150 octane fuel. The detonation threshold had moved. The engine could sustain power settings that would have destroyed it on the fuel the charts assumed it was burning. Wetmore had not calculated this. He had felt it. He had pushed past the limits, listened to the engine, watched the temperature gauges, and discovered empirically what the engineers in Derby and Packard's plant in Detroit would not formally document for months. The fuel had changed the rules. And the rules, in the specific tactical situation of early 1945, mattered enormously. Because the Me-262 had arrived, the jet that should have been untouchable, the Messerschmitt Me-262 Schwalbe, Swallow, was not a secret by the time it entered operational service. Allied intelligence had known something was coming. Reconnaissance photographs had shown the distinctive swept-wing twin-engine silhouettes parked at Lechfeld and other Luftwaffe test facilities as early as 1943. The question was not whether Germany had a jet aircraft. The question was whether it mattered. The Me-262 answered that question in a specific way. It was faster than anything the Allies had in the air, by a margin that was not marginal. The Me-262A1A, the fighter variant, was powered by two Junkers Jumo 004B turbojet engines, each producing approximately 898 pounds of thrust at sea level. At altitude, the aircraft's maximum speed was 540 miles per hour. Some sources put it closer to 559 in ideal conditions. The P-51D Mustang, at its rated war emergency power setting, achieved a maximum of 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet under standard conditions. Do the arithmetic yourself. That is a gap of over 100 miles per hour. In aerial combat, 100 miles per hour of speed advantage is not a tactical edge. It is a different category of aircraft. The official Allied response to the Me-262 threat was a set of tactical doctrines that acknowledged the speed gap as a given and attempted to work around it. Mustang pilots were told to catch the 262 during takeoff and landing, when its engines, the Jumo 004B, was notoriously unreliable at low power settings and had a catastrophic tendency to flame out during aggressive throttle movements, made it slow and vulnerable. They were told to set up ambushes near known jet airfields. They were told explicitly not to attempt to engage a Me-262 in a straightforward pursuit from behind, because the pursuit would fail. The doctrine was sound. The arithmetic was correct. The Mustang could not outrun the Me-262.
except that a small number of pilots had begun to suspect that the arithmetic was wrong in a specific and exploitable way. Meet Major Robin Olds. 22 years old, from Honolulu, Hawaii, though his family roots were in Virginia, and his father was a World War I pursuit pilot of some reputation. Before the war, Olds had been a football star at West Point. He was a tackle of sufficient quality that he was considered a legitimate professional prospect before the Army Air Forces decided his talents were better applied elsewhere. He flew P-38 Lightnings and then P-51D Mustangs with the 434th Fighter Squadron, 479th Fighter Group, based at Wattisham in Suffolk. He would finish the war with 12 aerial victories, and he would go on to become one of the most decorated fighter pilots in American history, shooting down 4 MiG-21s over Vietnam in 1967 at the age of 44. But in the winter of 1944 to 45, Olds was doing something that his group commander would not have officially sanctioned. He was running experiments. Specifically, he was running experiments on what happened to the Me-262's speed advantage when you changed the geometry of the engagement. The official doctrine assumed a pursuit scenario, Mustang behind a 262, trying to close the distance in level flight or a slight climb. In that scenario, the 262 simply flew away. But Olds had noticed something in the engagements he had observed and participated in. The 262 was not uniformly faster than the Mustang in all flight regimes. It was faster in level flight at altitude. It was faster in a climb. But in a dive, a steep, committed, maximum angle dive, the speed relationship became complicated. The Me-262 had a limiting Mach number of 0.86. This was a hard limit. Above that speed, the swept wings began to experience compressibility effects. The airflow over the wing surface approached sonic velocity, creating shock waves that disrupted lift and control. The aircraft would pitch violently, become uncontrollable, and in several documented cases did not recover. German pilots knew this limit precisely and respected it absolutely. The P-51D had a limiting Mach number of 0.805, slightly lower. But the Mustang was lighter, 10,100 pounds maximum takeoff weight against the Me-262's 14,110 pounds. And lighter aircraft in a dive accelerate faster. This is the physics that the doctrine had underweighted. The Me-262 was faster in level flight. But in a dive initiated from the same altitude, the Mustang could, in specific circumstances, reach its limiting Mach number faster than the 262 could reach its own. The window was narrow, perhaps 15 to 20 seconds of engagement geometry, but it existed. And Wetmore had found something else, something that Olds's geometric analysis had not accounted for. If you were already at the top of the approved power envelope, or past it, when you initiated the dive, the Mustang's acceleration in that first critical 15 seconds was not what the handbook predicted. It was faster. The specific mechanism was this. The Merlin, running at above war emergency power settings on 150-octane fuel, was producing not 1,695 horsepower, but something closer to 1,850 to 1,900 horsepower, depending on the specific engine, its state of wear, and the atmospheric conditions. The exact figure has never been definitively established because no one was running calibrated dynamometer tests at 27,000 feet in combat. What is established is that pilots who used the technique reported a noticeably faster acceleration response than the handbook predicted, and the physics of what was happening inside the engine supports the conclusion that the output was significantly above the rated war emergency figure. Hold that number, 1,900 horsepower. In an aircraft weighing
combat-loaded approximately 9,800 pounds. That is a power-to-weight ratio that, in a dive, produced acceleration figures that the Me-262, heavier, with turbojets that built thrust more slowly than a piston engine's instantaneous torque response, could not match in the first critical seconds. The technique was not safe. The engine wear it produced was measurable and cumulative. Wetmore's crew chief Buxton later described examining the engine after missions where the technique had been used. The rings were always a little more worn. The valve seats showed heat patterns that the maintenance manual said meant the engine was running too hot. We'd have to do a more thorough inspection, sometimes pull heads to check for cracking. It added hours to the turnaround. It also worked. And the people who needed to understand whether it worked, the pilots of the 8th Air Force's fighter groups, were paying attention. If this investigation is giving you a clearer picture of what was actually happening in those Mustang cockpits, not the version that survived in the official performance charts, but the version that pilots were passing between themselves when the squadron commander wasn't listening, hit the like button. It keeps this kind of history visible a little longer. That matters. Часть третья. 4 minutes over the Rhine. February of 1945. The specific date is not documented with certainty in the records that survived, which is itself a small piece of evidence. Engagements that produced unofficial results were often recorded with less precision than those that fit the expected narrative. What is documented is the mission type, a long-range escort for B-17 Flying Fortresses of the 1st Bombardment Division, targeting rail marshalling yards in the Frankfurt area. 8 Mustangs of the 359th Fighter Group were flying high cover at 27,000 feet, approximately 12 miles east of the Rhine. Wetmore was leading the flight. The first indication of the 262 was not visual. It was a call from another flight, lower, who had seen contrails at 9 o'clock and called them out as bandits, fast movers, jet type. By the time Wetmore had located the contrails visually, the 262, there was one, not a formation, which was itself unusual. The jets typically hunted in pairs, was already below and to the left, traveling east at what he estimated as 500 miles per hour. The standard response was established. Do not pursue. The 262 is faster. Let it go. Protect the bombers. Call out its position. Wetmore did not do the standard thing. What he did instead requires a precise reconstruction, because the sequence of inputs mattered enormously. He did not push the throttle forward first. That was the mistake other pilots made. The instinctive response was to go to full power and then turn toward the threat. But at 27,000 feet in a level turn, you bled speed before the engine had time to build to its maximum output. By the time you completed the turn, you were slower than you had been, and the 262 was already 1,000 yards further away. What Wetmore did was roll inverted first. He rolled the Mustang inverted, pulled back on the stick, which, inverted, pushed the nose down, and committed to a dive of approximately 45 degrees. Only then, with the nose pointed down and the aircraft already accelerating under gravity, did he advance the throttle. Past military power, past war emergency power, into the band that had no name in the handbook. The physics of this sequence were precise. By rolling inverted and pulling into the dive before adding power, he had already converted altitude into airspeed before the engine reached its maximum output. When the throttle came forward into the forbidden zone, the engine was not fighting gravity. It was working with it. The Merlin, running on 150-octane fuel at above-rated manifold pressure, added its output to the energy the aircraft was already accumulating from the dive. The 262 pilot, whose name does not appear in any surviving record, had not seen the Mustang roll. He was watching the bomber formation, or he was watching his instruments, or he was simply not expecting a propeller-driven fighter to do what was happening behind him. The 262 was accelerating eastward, probably unaware that the geometry of the engagement had just changed in a way that the official performance tables said was impossible. Wetmore later described what he saw in his gun sight in a debrief report that survives in the 8th Air Force Historical Research Agency archive. The target was filling the reticle faster than I expected. I had him at about 800 yards and closing. I thought I had maybe 5 seconds. He had less. He fired at approximately 600 yards, which was longer than ideal, but within effective range for the Mustang's 650 caliber machine guns. He got hits. The 262's right engine began trailing smoke. The 262 broke left. And here is where the engagement became something that neither the official doctrine nor the Me-262's designers had fully anticipated. A jet engine at combat power in 1945 did not respond to throttle inputs the way a piston engine did. The Jumo 004B had a spool-up time, the delay between moving the throttle and the engine producing significantly increased thrust, of approximately 8 to 12 seconds. In a dogfight, 8 to 12 seconds is an eternity. A piston engine, by contrast, responds to throttle input almost instantaneously, because the power increase comes from burning more fuel in cylinders that are already spinning at operating speed. When the 262 broke left, its pilot instinctively advanced his throttle. The left engine, still functioning, began building toward maximum thrust. But the right engine was damaged, producing reduced thrust, and for those 8 to 12 seconds while the left engine was spooling up and the right engine was degraded, the 262 was not accelerating the way its pilot expected. Wetmore had followed the brake. He was now in a turning engagement with a jet aircraft, the scenario that every piece of official doctrine said was impossible to win, because the jet was faster and could disengage whenever it chose. The 262 pilot made the correct decision. He attempted to disengage, pushed the nose down, used his speed advantage to extend away from the Mustang. But the right engine was trailing smoke heavily now, and the speed differential that should have made the disengagement trivial had been reduced by the engine damage. Wetmore, still running above war emergency power, stayed with him for another 45 seconds before the 262 pilot apparently made the decision to head for home rather than risk losing the second engine. The engagement ended without a kill. Wetmore's gun camera film showed hits on the right engine nacelle and the rear fuselage. The 262 was damaged and departed. No wreckage was found, no German records have surfaced confirming a loss, and the engagement was officially recorded as a probable, one step below a confirmed kill. But that is not the point. The point is that a P-51D Mustang had stayed with a Me-262 in a turning engagement for approximately 4 minutes, under conditions that the official performance analysis said made such an engagement impossible. When Wetmore landed at East Reetham and sat down with the intelligence officer, his debrief ran 45 minutes, significantly longer than a standard debrief. The intelligence officer, a first lieutenant named Charles Heron from Cleveland, Ohio, asked the same question 4 times in 4 different ways, trying to understand what Wetmore was telling him, because what Wetmore was describing did not match the performance data that 8th Air Force Fighter Command had been using to write its anti-jet doctrine. Heron wrote in his report, which survives, "Lieutenant Wetmore's account of the engagement is internally consistent and corroborated by gun camera film and witness statements from his flight. His description of the power settings used is outside the parameters specified in the aircraft's operating manual. He was unable to specify exactly what manifold pressure he was running. As he states, he was not looking at the gauge during the engagement. He estimates the throttle position was well forward of the WEP gate. His crew chief will be asked to examine the engine." The crew chief examined the engine. The wear patterns confirmed what Heron had suspected. Wetmore had been running the Merlin at a power setting that should not have been possible for the duration it was sustained. And the engine, against all official expectation, had held together. Часть четвертая. Verdict. Here is the forensic verdict of this investigation. The story of Wetmore's engagement over the Rhine and the broader story of the forbidden throttle technique that a handful of 8th Air Force pilots had developed independently and passed among themselves is not, at its core, a story about a miracle. It is not a story about a pilot who found a magic setting that turned his Mustang into something it was not. It is a story about the gap between official knowledge and operational knowledge, and about what happens when that gap is wide enough to matter. The official performance envelope of the P-51D Mustang was written at a specific moment in time, against a specific fuel standard, by engineers working with the information they had. The fuel standard changed. The information available to operational pilots, who were flying the aircraft every day against actual opponents at actual altitudes, evolved faster than the official documentation could track. The result was a situation in which the official handbook was systematically underestimating what the aircraft could do, and the pilots who had discovered the discrepancy were in possession of a tactical advantage that they could not officially claim. This is not unusual in the history of military technology. It is, in fact, the standard condition. Consider the numbers precisely. The P-51D at rated war emergency power, 1,695 horsepower. The P-51D at the power settings Wetmore and a small number of other pilots were running on 150-octane fuel. Best estimates from post-war engineering analysis place the figure between 1,850 and 1,930 horsepower, depending on engine condition and atmospheric variables. That is an increase of between 9 and 14% above the rated maximum. 9 to 14% does not sound like much, but apply it to the specific tactical problem of the Me-262 engagement, and it becomes decisive in a narrow window. The Me-262's speed advantage over the Mustang in level flight at altitude was approximately 100 to 120 miles per hour. That advantage was real, and it was not overcome by the forbidden throttle technique. Wetmore did not make his Mustang faster than the 262 in level flight. He never claimed he did. What he did was change the geometry of the engagement so that the 262's speed advantage was not the determining factor in the first 30 to 45 seconds of contact. The dive initiation technique, roll inverted, pull into the dive, then add power, exploited 3 specific characteristics simultaneously. First, the Mustang's lighter weight gave it faster acceleration in the dive's initial phase. Second, the above-rated power setting added thrust at the moment when the aircraft was already accelerating under gravity, compounding the energy gain. Third, and most critically, the commitment of the dive forced the 262 pilot into a reactive posture. He was no longer the hunter, choosing the terms of engagement. He was the hunted, making decisions under time pressure. A jet engine in 1945 under time pressure was a liability. The Jumo 004B's spool-up time of 8 to 12 seconds meant that the 262's speed advantage was not instantly available. It had to be built. In those 8 to 12 seconds, the Mustang, already at maximum output because the piston engine's power was instantaneous, could close distance, get hits, and damage the systems that made the 262's eventual speed advantage possible. Wetmore understood this intuitively. He could not have written the engineering explanation. But he had flown enough combat hours. By February of 1945, he had logged over 200 combat hours, which is a quantity of empirical data that no test pilot in a controlled environment could replicate, to have arrived at the correct tactical conclusion. The question that the official doctrine had answered incorrectly was not, can a Mustang outrun an Me-262? The answer to that question was no, and it remained no. The question Wetmore had answered correctly was different. Is there a specific sequence of maneuvers initiated from a specific geometric position using a specific power setting
that gives a Mustang pilot a 30 to 45-second window in which the 262's speed advantage is either neutralized or insufficient to prevent engagement? The answer to that question was yes. And the answer was yes because of the fuel. The 150-octane aviation fuel that the American refining industry had been producing in increasing quantities since 1943 was one of the least celebrated and most consequential technological achievements of the entire war. It did not make headlines. It did not produce aces. It did not appear in combat footage. It sat in tanks at forward airfields in England and was pumped into aircraft before missions by ground crews who had no particular reason to think about what they were doing. What they were doing was moving the detonation threshold of the Merlin engine upward by a margin that changed what the engine could sustain. Not forever, not safely, but in the specific envelope of a combat engagement, where 5 minutes of extreme output could be the difference between a kill and a coffin. The fuel had quietly rewritten the rules.
The 8th Air Force did not formally revise the P-51D's operating manual to reflect the 150-octane capability before the war ended. The revision was in process when Germany surrendered in May of 1945. It was completed and issued in the post-war period, but by then, the aircraft it described was already being retired. What the revision would have shown, had it been issued in time, was this. At 150-octane fuel, the Merlin V1650-7 could sustain manifold pressure settings and RPM combinations that produced significantly above rated power for durations longer than the 5-minute war emergency limit, without the catastrophic engine damage that the original limit had been set to prevent. The limit had been conservative, appropriately conservative for 100-octane fuel. It was too conservative for 150-octane fuel. The pilots who had discovered this were not reckless. They were empirical. They had run the experiment on themselves, in combat, at altitude, with the stakes being whether they lived or died. That is a testing regime that no laboratory can replicate and no engineering team can fully account for. Raymond Earl Wetmore survived the war. He finished with 21.5 confirmed aerial victories, the half coming from a shared kill that the records attribute partially to his wingman, making him the second highest scoring ace in the 359th Fighter Group. He left the Army Air Forces in 1945, returned briefly to Missouri Valley College, and then rejoined the newly independent United States Air Force in 1947. He died in a flying accident in 1951, at 27 years old, when an F-86 Sabre he was flying during a routine training flight experienced a control malfunction at low altitude. He is buried at Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery in St. Louis, Missouri. His crew chief, Technical Sergeant Harold Buxton, returned to Lansing, Michigan after the war and spent 30 years working for the Oldsmobile Division of General Motors as an engine assembly inspector. He was interviewed by aviation historian Robert Powell in 1978. He said of Wetmore, "He knew that engine better than the people who built it. Not on paper, in his hands. There's a difference." Robin Olds went on to a career that became one of the defining stories of American air power. Vietnam, the Wolfpack, a second generation of aerial kills against a second generation of jet aircraft. He died in 2007 at 84 years old at his home in Steamboat Springs, Colorado. His memoir, Fighter Pilot, published posthumously, contains a brief passage about the winter of 1944 to 45 in which he describes watching Mustang pilots develop what he called a feel for the engine that the book hadn't caught up to yet. He did not name Wetmore specifically. He did not need to. The Me-262 pilots who encountered the forbidden throttle technique and survived, and most of them did survive, because the technique produced engagements rather than kills, and most of those engagements ended inconclusively.
presumably filed their own reports. Those reports, if they survived the chaos of the final months of the Third Reich and the subsequent Allied seizure of Luftwaffe archives, have not surfaced in the literature in a form that directly addresses the phenomenon. What the German records do show is a pattern. Me-262 pilots in the last months of the war began reporting that certain Mustang engagements did not follow the expected script. The Americans, some of them, were not breaking away. They were turning in. And the jet, in those first critical seconds, was not pulling away as fast as the performance tables said it should. The German pilots filed these reports.
Their commanders noted them. The war ended before anyone had time to figure out what the Americans had found. Now you know what they found. They found the gap between the chart and the engine, between the manual and the fuel, between the official limit and the limit that the metal, under the right conditions, would actually tolerate. They found it the way operational knowledge is always found, not in a laboratory, not in a test cell, not in a conference room where engineers present data to generals. They found it in the air, at 27,000 feet, in the specific and unforgiving classroom of a combat engagement where the only grade that mattered was whether you came home. Wetmore rolled inverted above the Rhine, pulled the nose through the horizon, and pushed the throttle past the gate that the handbook said was the end of the road. The engine held, the gap closed, and for 4 minutes over a landscape of craters and broken roads, a propeller-driven fighter from St. Joseph, Missouri, stayed with the fastest aircraft Germany had ever put in the air. Well forward of the WEP gate, that was all he could tell the intelligence officer. He wasn't looking at the gauge. He was looking at the 262. That is the kind of knowledge that wins wars, not the knowledge that lives in manuals, the knowledge that lives in hands. If this investigation gave you something, a clearer picture of what was actually happening in those cockpits, in those last months, when the official doctrine said one thing and the pilots were doing another, hit the like button. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. And remember, the limit on the page and the limit in the metal are never quite the same number. The pilots who understood that distinction were the ones who came home. The Rhine is still there. The craters are long filled. The Merlins are mostly silent now, in museums and restoration hangars, run up occasionally for airshow crowds who have no idea what the engine sounded like when it was asked for everything it had. Wetmore knew.